Raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and to pull up a chair as we gather together here in our very favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, exploring all the ages, all seven of them, from the Stone Age to the Wood Age and the modern information age of technological overload. And we've been experiencing a little of that tonight here in the Crosstime Pub, joined, as always, I am by James Waldo and Jason Pentrail, our geologist, and our environmental scientist and avocationalist archaeologist extraordinaire. Gentlemen, how are you? Jason, sir, all's well?
All is well. You know, it's the time of the year when soccer is wrapping up for the kids and the impending summertime schedule approaches. So, you know, summer camps and family vacations and swimming pools and sunburns and all of the great things that come along with summertime.
Summertime and the living is easy. I hope it's easy up there in the Ozarks or close to them for you there, James.
Well, it's way easier than Jason because all of our kids are out of the house. So when I go to the pool, I just go to the pool. Great.
That's always nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
I wonder if our Paleolithic hunter friends spent much time in the pool. If they were in the pool, presumably they were probably going after aquatic life forms that were edible and things that might help them in their daily battle to survive. You know, there was a really interesting piece, though, that appeared in the New York Times recently, talking about whether or not we might as well refer to it as the Wood Age instead of the Stone Age. I don't need to even get into the details of this article, simply to express the point. It's one that we've talked about many times in the past here on the program, that of course we refer to it as the Stone Age because what kinds of implements would have survived the test of time? Yeah, all the stone stuff, but in likelihood wood would have been used, and probably other kinds of resources too. It's just that those perishable resources have not lasted as long as stone, and therefore, unfortunately, there's a little less evidence of their use. That certainly does not mean that they were not used.
So yeah, this is serious, but it's also sort of a joke, or maybe it's a joke and it's also sort of serious. But when does the Stone Age, or when does the Wood Age become the Stone Age? When there's no wood left. Right?
There you go.
So that's what we have here.
Yeah, again, I think that when there's no wood left, i.e. when the wood that was obviously being used and probably proliferated even more so than the stone in many instances, not of course that stone with sharper edges and with harder surfaces wouldn't have been maybe preferential in terms of use for projectiles, but again, anybody who's sat next to a bonfire at night and who has turned a stick in the fire and worked it against stone, you know how easy it is to work it to a sharpened point. I used to do that when I was a kid. And my mom would say, you know, this is one way that spears, you know, javelins, things along those lines would have been made and used, of course, by ancient hunters. But now, that to me is no mystery. We know that biological processes break down perishable substances like wood over time, and that we can expect that they are going to be left absent from history. And so we have to kind of fill in the blanks. But what really interests me are these archaeological curiosities, one of which I recently actually wrote a pretty lengthy article about. These are the Roman Dodecahedrons. Do you guys remember these things?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, these are one of the most interesting small artifacts. You know, oftentimes we talk about larger things, but something that you can hold in the palm of your hand with a very unique shape. So what do you have as far as that goes?
Well, these have fascinated me for a long time. I remember, gosh, maybe a decade ago, I had written a blog post about these, and it got a lot of traffic. I mean, it was a really, really popular article, and so it prompted me to want to kind of revisit this, because as recently as January, at an English archaeological dig, they actually found one of these. And there's some interesting things about these guys. Normally, again, the dodecahedron being 12-sided with pentagonal faces, there's a little knob at the conjoints of each of the little faces where they converge. And then there are holes of different sizes through most of the faces, which seems to be a kind of a clue as to what these things might have been used for. I mean, if the holes through each of the sides were uniform, that would suggest maybe that this is decorative. Again, the English archaeologists who unearthed one earlier this year, they said that because they come from the Gallo-Roman period, and of course its association with the different mystery cults, their belief is, of course, that this is probably a religious item. Whereas others have said maybe that they actually are used as rangefinders. That might be suggestive of the different sizes of the holes on the different pentagonal faces. Again, to me, I mean, I guess just my modern engineering and science-oriented mind tends to look at that and say this is a device that was made with a purpose. And furthermore, the thing about presuming that, well, because they are from this period, therefore they must have religious significance that we'll never understand, they are occult objects. Again, how often is this theory rested upon when we don't have any kind of other explanation for these objects? I mean, that to me is a well-worn and perhaps overly used hypothesis. I'm just not sold on the idea that these dodecahedrons necessarily were used for that purpose. Now, people have found a number of very interesting uses for these, including as knitting implements, universal candlestick holders. No joke. I mean, again, we have to look at the device and the clues inherent to how it is designed. With each of the little knobs, it seems suggestive that it's intended to be able to sit flat on surfaces no matter how it falls. But the little holes being of varying sizes is suggestive of, again, some other kind of a mechanical purpose. And so some have even said maybe they are universal candlestick holders with the different sizes of holes designed to hold different widths of candles. I don't know. I mean, any guess is as good as mine, but I would think that with all the blood protein analysis we can do now with stone and other things, if there were any remnants of wax to be found on these objects, certainly we should be able to discern that as well. Maybe if we can do some kind of, chemical analysis, we can determine something else about them. But another important point, I think, is that for the period, being made of essentially bronze, right? Copper alloy. I mean, this is a substance that's not going to be necessarily easily accessible at that time. I mean, it was around, but I mean, the sign of its use alone seems to be suggestive of tradecraft, right? Some have even tried to say that the creation of a dodecahedron might have been some sort of a metalsmithing badge of honor. To prove your worth as a metalsmith, you had to be able to create one of these things and to produce them. I think there's only a few hundred of them known. And here's another weird clue. To my knowledge, none have been found around Rome, Italy. I mean, in the very heart of the Roman Empire, that's where they seem to be essentially absent. So whatever these things were, they were carried with people to different parts of the greater empire. We don't know what their purpose is. They remain an archaeological mystery. And that's just baffling, but also fascinating to me.
Yeah, they're very interesting looking. And just from the way that they're constructed, I mean, they're very, that's a very complicated item. And even today with modern techniques and modern welding equipment, that would be difficult to make. So whoever was making those things were really kind of a master of their trade. And the only thing that I've heard that really makes some kind of like practical sense, like why would you go to all the trouble to make that thing or a lot of those things, right? Now, I will say, honestly, we probably have 3 or 4 things in the house that look like this that came from like Hobby Lobby or something that my wife picked up. It's like a modern art sculpture almost. But the knitting implement where it was, twine or knitting material that was wrapped around these circular knobs on the outside of this thing. And it was, basically like a big twine ball like you might see today, where somebody would have knitting needles and it was just coming straight off of that. That actually makes pretty good sense. Or maybe something similar, fishing line or something like that, to where it's some kind of small twine. I don't mean like 2-pound tests. Obviously, that's not what I'm talking about. But it almost, they're decorative, but they, when you think about some practical uses, they seem like they would be very useful. But those things were super difficult to make. So why do it?
Well, here's the theory. What if they're ancient fishing reels?
So that's what I meant, right? When I talked about a fishing where you put the line around it, you could just wind it up, on this, and then that would, keep all your line in place. Or I don't know how you would implement it with like a rod type of a deal, but I kind of maybe see where you're going with that.
Although, I mean, there would be much simpler ways to construct rudimentary fishing reels as opposed to going to the trouble of casting out of bronze a 12-sided one fitted with holes of different sizes. But again, right. I mean, to the maker, perhaps the idea was if you have a rod of different sizes, the different widths of the hole are to be able to accommodate different, widths of the actual wooden rod,
right,
to which this ancient Roman fishing reel is attached. I don't know. Any idea is this? I mean, here's the thing. You could definitely use it for that. Let's put it that way. You could definitely use this thing to make mittens. People have demonstrated this online in videos. There are a lot of different potential uses. And so again, maybe another theory is, what if this is an ancient portable multi-device? This thing is actually designed to be able to do all different kinds of stuff. It could have been a rangefinder and could have been used for mittens, could have been used as part of a gaming, situation, some sort of a gaming implement of some kind. I don't know.
Yeah, I could see this as a range finding device too. I think you could make a case for that.
Well, some have. In fact, there's an Italian scientist who's written papers about that, where she argues that based on publicly available data, that her conclusion is rangefinder is probably the best use. But again, there have been others who have also made very convincing arguments against the rangefinder hypothesis. And
maybe it was part of like a more elaborate device, not quite a sextant necessarily, but something that would have this as part of the device, and the connecting pieces, the wooden pieces or the other things are long gone, and all you got really left is the device, the rudimentary device.
This comes back to our question about, again, the Wood Age versus the Stone Age. Is it possible that these were, again, appended to some other kind of perishable technology, and that has gone the way of, well, I guess ancient Rome at least, and we no longer have those implements? Now, here's another clue, one final clue, and then we'll move on and get into gear here, of course, because we've got a discussion about the archaeology of Gaza coming up. But another clue is that often these Roman dodecahedrons are found in either coin caches or in near proximity to them. And so some have asked if they had some sort of a relationship to coins. Maybe they were used as some kind of an ancient calculator. Maybe they were used for something else, some, kind of tool used to, I don't know, do any number of things.
Maybe it's a standardized size so you could check the authenticity of coinage. I
mean, yeah, because these things often appeared near coin caches or actually within them. Others interpret that to mean that these things actually had material wealth themselves. Now, I would kind of think that it's more like what you're talking about, that they have some sort of non-wealth relationship to coins. But again, who knows? Maybe the craftsmanship was deemed something of incredible wealth in ancient Rome, and hence their rarity, why there are only maybe a few hundred of them. Obviously, there must be others out there. We haven't found them all. But if anybody out there has any ideas about what these Roman dodecahedrons might actually be used for, we'd love to hear from you. You can drop us a line. Just check out the email addresses available right there at 7ages.org. I think info@7ages.org is the catch-all, but you can always write to us individually, Micah, Jason, or James, at 7ages.org. Anyway, moving along here before we get into the interview, Jason, I know there have been some fun sessions over there with the Green Dragon Book Club. What else is going on with the Patreon lately?
Yeah, that's just one of many shows. I recently uploaded a new Digging Deeper episode with our friend Dr. Randy Daniel of East Carolina University. So that is now available as well, where we get into the Hardaway culture and lots of his research from the past. So a great episode there, as well as the Cross Time Pub and, of course, the Green Dragon Book Club. And we're always working on new things as well. We're going to have a get-together, if you will, a meeting coming up. So look at our social media. I'm going to be posting a date for that. And it's just going to be a hangout. It's not going to be a podcast, just an opportunity for folks to get together and ask some questions and get to know each other. And so, again, I'll be posting that on all of the 7 Ages social media with a date and time. So feel free to join us there as well.
That sounds fantastic. And, of course, as always, I mentioned the website. You can follow us over there at 7ages.org. SAAJ.org, and on all the relevant social media platforms. Jason is probably the most active in his role as moderator of the official 7Ages Facebook discussion group. You can find that there on Facebook. And of course, keep up with us and all the latest shows. So I guess it's time for us to jump right into things. We're going back in time to the ancient Crossroads in search of the mysterious archaeology of a particular region in the ancient past. Here in a moment, when we return, we'll be joined by Dr. Louise Steel from the University of Wales for a discussion about the archaeology of Gaza, right here on the 7Ages Audio Journal.
Tonight on the 7Ages Audio Journal, we're speaking with Dr. Louise Steel. Dr. Steel is professor of Near Eastern Archaeology at the University of Wales. In the 1990s, she directed excavations at the late Bronze Age site of Moghraqa in Gaza. She has also worked extensively in Cyprus, directing fieldwork at Archaeology. Her recent research focuses on new materialities, exploring people's relationship with matter and how this has been entangled in their daily lived experiences. She is series editor of Materialities in Anthropology and Archaeology, University of Wales Press. Louise is associate director of the UNESCO-MOST BRIDGES UK hub, which explores transdisciplinary approaches to sustainability science, and is PI of Coastal Tales, which examines how cultural heritage can help foster resilience to climate change in coastal areas. Dr. Steel, welcome to the 7Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, we always like to learn a little bit more about our guests. We have so much to take in tonight. All of your experience in Gaza and also Cyprus. This is an area that we haven't really had a opportunity to cover on the show previously. So I know I've learned a lot in researching this, and I'm sure that the listeners are looking forward to this as well. But before we get into all of those details, it's important to know a little bit more about our guests. So tell us a little bit about your interest and the journey that has led to this career in archaeology.
Oh gosh, it's as long as I can remember, really. I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was growing up. My best friend who lived down the road, his father was an archaeologist, and I remember being taken sort of age 3 to go and see an excavation, and there was an abandoned Victorian villa in the fields behind where we live, and we were convinced we'd found a Roman villa, and we used to go and excavate it and bring back broken bath tiles back into his parents' kitchen and sit there and wash them and sort of sort them out and things. So it was just something that was kindled very early on. I always loved history. I'm very interested in the past, and never looked back, really. So age 3, first excavation.
Looking ahead a little bit, you obviously knew from an early age that this was going to be where you wanted to go with your career. So as you pursue your degrees and get through your college experience, tell us about your first professional archaeologist job, your first experience in the field as a professional.
That was probably post my undergraduate degree. Had been involved in a lot of excavations as a volunteer from school and throughout my university days. But when I was doing my PhD, I did some volunteering and then eventually got paid for the local archaeological service in Surrey, which is where my parents live. So that was my first paid job, and it was they were building the M25 at the time, which is the big ring road around London. And we were excavating a rescue excavation of a medieval and Saxon cemetery. So that was the first place where I was actually paid to go and excavate. And I did quite a bit of paid work with archaeology post PhD as well. That was my sort of before I got jobs in university. I was working for them and worked on a Roman temple site in in Guildford and various other sites. So yeah, that's where I started, but very different to the Mediterranean.
Yeah, for sure. Well, what an opportunity to have such a diverse group of experiences. Something that I always find interesting with the world of archaeology is how I perceived it. As I was very much like you, have loved it from an early age. But once you actually begin doing it, it often has some surprises. So once you got into the world of professional archaeology, was there anything unexpected about the practice that you really weren't prepared for?
I suppose because I'd been doing so much from age 16 when I first volunteered, I sort of got used to it. I think sometimes the pragmatism which archaeologists who are in the field actually deal with stuff, especially when it's a rescue situation, you can't cover everything. So I think that was probably the first shock that I really had, was how much quicker it is and how much less emphasis there is on getting everything. It's just getting what you really need out, but you can't recover everything. I think that was probably the biggest shock. It's very different to research excavation, where you can take your time and do exactly what you want to do. So that was probably the big shock.
Yes, I agree with you completely on that. Salvage operations are often very sad in a way, because so much is out of context, so much is lost. Now, as far as various disciplines and aspects of archaeology, I know that you have an affinity for materiality. So tell us how that began for you. What was the major attraction to that particular area of archaeology?
I think right from really going to university, that was the thing which always fascinated me, was the things that people made and held and used on a daily basis, and what that tells you about their lives, their lived experience, their daily practice. And frequently, well, I was very lucky very early on. I was given the opportunity to work on the pottery from a really important site in Cyprus, a place called Kalabassos, and just sort of seeing what information you can tease out of essentially just broken pottery sherds, but they really do tell a story, and the way that where they're found, and are they being thrown away, how they're being looked after, how much use did they have, and the different types of pottery for different types of activities, so cooking and eating and drinking and exotic imported wares. So it was just that. But it's really that very much that idea that somebody in the past held that and used it and maybe drank from a cup. I find that really sort of makes hairs on the back of your head go up sometimes.
Yeah, it really does. And I understand and relate to that completely. I know exactly what you mean. Holding something that hasn't been seen in literally thousands of years is a sobering experience, to say the least. I find that very interesting, and what a beautiful place to be able to work. So you're now a professional archaeologist, you're taking part in excavations and research, but how did you manage to find yourself working in the archaeology of Cyprus?
Oh, it was sort of a happy chance, really. I was doing a wonderful degree. I went to the University of Liverpool, and they had a wonderful degree which looked at the different cultures of the East Mediterranean, the Bronze Age Aegean, the Canaanites, ancient Egypt, and as far east as Mesopotamia. And in our second year, we had to do field work in the area of our specialization. And at that time, I was really interested in the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, but there weren't the opportunities for me to go and excavate in Greece. But I found this wonderful excavation in Cyprus, the site of Kalabassos, where I eventually ended up looking at their pottery and went over. Didn't know anything about Cyprus. We hadn't touched upon it. There's one bit in the East Mediterranean we hadn't looked at in our degree, and just fell in love with it. As you say, it's a wonderful island, wonderful people, and it's absolutely amazing archaeology. So just fell in love with it and never looked back. And at the time, there wasn't that much Cypriot archaeology going on in Britain at that time, so it was a sort of one of those. It was an opportunity.
For
it was
sure.
just a happy chance.
Yeah, well, there's again, oftentimes you never know where archaeology is going to take you, and sometimes you get those wonderful surprises like that. I know that the first item that you published on from Cyprus was very meaningful to you, and that was a Mycenaean crater. Is that correct?
That's
tell
correct,
us
yes.
tell us a little bit about, what was your connection to that particular object, and why did you resonate with it so much?
Well, it was a lovely a crater. It's a large pot which was used for mixing wine and water, and it served as a centerpiece for a dining set. And this one was excavated in a tomb. But I'd actually started excavating the tomb, but then went off to do the pottery. And it was really interesting because the decoration on it was completely unparalleled. And normally they'd have a scene of a chariot procession, but this one had a woman sitting inside a little building with what looks like horns of consecrations on top. So it looked like a religious scene and maybe a goddess. She had this sort of flounce skirt on, which is very Minoan or Mycenaean. And it was found in a tomb where a woman was buried. And so there are all sorts of lovely questions coming up about were women admitted to ceremonies where there'd be feasting and eating and drinking? Did the choice of decoration reflect the identity of the person whose pot it was? So there are sort of lots of lovely questions which came up from that. But it was also just the opportunity to research something and publish something which was totally and utterly unheard of. It was a unique object, so it was very exciting.
Yes, and on your there's a presentation you give on YouTube from the University of Wales, and if anybody wants to go look that up, you can see this beautiful item. There's a great picture of it there on that presentation. When we're talking about Cyprus, as far as the archaeology goes, tell us a little bit about the stratigraphy and what kind of environment are you working in archaeologically in Cyprus?
So the bit of Cyprus or the type of archaeology in Cyprus that I'm engaged in is late Bronze Age archaeology. And for the most part, there's not very deep stratigraphy in the site that I've been excavating, the site of Eredu. It really is just a single occupation layer. And it's not very deep. In most cases, it's the archaeology is just below the plough soil, really. So the fact that it survived is quite remarkable. There are places where the underlying topography of the ground sort of has lots of dips, and we've got this amazing room, this sunken room, which had a really deep deposit of sort of about a metre and a half. But for the most part, we're maybe going down 20, 30 centimetres, and then you're on the surface and you're sort of walking on the ground that the ancients walked on. And the other sites I've worked on in Cyprus are very similar in terms of not having a great depth of stratigraphy. Sort of if you get down onto the main phase of occupation, there might be sort of small layers of stratigraphy in different occupation phases, but it's not like the tell archaeology of the Near East. It's much easier.
Are the archaeological sites in Cyprus mostly located along the coast, and are they more centered in the center of the island?
They're scattered all over the island. There's been a tendency for archaeologists, especially focusing on the Late Bronze Age, to focus on the coastal settlements. They're quite large, and many of those were engaged in trade and exchange with the East Mediterranean and the Aegean. So they've tended to be the focus, but there's a lot of archaeology in the hinterland that we don't know much about, and that's really why I went into the hinterland with Eredu, because I was interested in smaller farming communities rather than the big cosmopolitan community, to meet the real Cypriots, I suppose. But yeah, there's a lot in the hinterland, but not much excavation there.
So working in Cyprus initially and then moving over to Gaza, what type of lessons did you learn in Cyprus that were applicable to your work when you got to Gaza?
I think the stuff which really helped me in Cyprus was being very detailed in the way in which we recorded objects and pottery and thinking about the context that they were found in. So I think that was the knowledge that myself and my colleague that we took over with us, and really, sort of really focusing in on the material remains. It is a very different type of archaeology, though the site we were excavating in Gaza was also a site without a deep stratigraphy. It was, you can go down that far and you hit the archaeology fairly quickly. So we weren't engaging in tell archaeology. Cyprus would not have prepared me for excavating the tell site at all. But luckily, that's not what we did. So,
right, no, that's completely understandable. So you're deeply involved in the archaeology of Cyprus, and then how do you find yourself all of a sudden in Gaza and taking on a completely new type of archaeology?
That's a very good question. I think a lot of it was the naivety of youth. I'm going to be honest there. So in my mid-20s and quite excited about going and doing something different. But I was engaged in postdoctoral research, and I was researching at the time Mycenaean pottery, which is imported to the East Mediterranean. And there are sort of lots of studies of lots of places where Mycenaean pottery was coming in. We didn't know much about what was going on in Gaza. There was stuff from the site of Tel al-Ajul, but not very much Mycenaean pottery there. So that was a sort of a question mark of why wasn't there Mycenaean pottery turning up there? So, that was what I was interested in, was sort of the connections in Gaza with the Aegean world. And my colleague who I was working with was just interested in Near Eastern archaeology. But we were both interested in the Late Bronze Age. We wanted to know a little bit more about the Late Bronze Age. And as we got to research it more and more, Gaza became really, really interesting. And the fact is, 2 or 3 really important sites there for the Bronze Age, but not much is known about them. So they're sort of accidents of old excavations, I think, a lot of them.
So you're really not finding much indicators of Aegean interaction at Gaza? Is that the case?
Not at the site that we went to look at. And the site of Tel al-Ajul, which is probably the best known of the sites in Gaza, there's a lot of evidence there for Cypriot pottery and interactions with Cyprus, but Petrie, who excavated there, did not find very much Mycenaean pottery there. There are bits, and mainly in the cemeteries. But there's another site a little bit further south, a site called Dar el-Balah, and there was a fair amount of Mycenaean pottery there. And I was, again, very fortunate. I was given the opportunity by the excavator of that site to publish the Mycenaean pottery from Dar el-Balah. So it was sort of interesting pictures. It sort of shades of different types of interactions going on there, which was quite interesting.
Yeah, no, I find that very interesting, because Cyprus is really, as the crow flies, not very far. Approximately how far?
Cyprus, there was a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. How far is Cyprus from Gaza, approximately, as the crow flies? Rough estimate.
I think it's something from Gaza to Cyprus. That's quite way down the coast. I think it's only something like 50 kilometers from the north tip of Cyprus to the coast of Syria. But yeah, it's quite a way down south. It's a circular loop of trade around the East Mediterranean. So, but Ajul and Cyprus, there are really strong connections.
Well, again, for my audience here, mostly in the U.S., are not as familiar with the area. So let's begin as we explore Gaza. Let's start with topography and the size. I understand Gaza really is a small area when you look at the surrounding region. So what is the topography, and what are we looking at as far as size?
Okay, well, size, it is very, very small. In miles, it's the Gaza Strip is about 25 miles in length, or 40 kilometers. So I imagine America, you might prefer miles. And it's only about 4 miles wide to 7.5 miles wide at its widest point. So, it's a tiny stretch of land. And in terms of topography, the key thing that defines Gaza region is the Wadi Gaza, and that stands out. It's a wetland. The Palestinian authorities did in 2012 apply to the World Heritage Organization for it to be recognized as a site of important interest, and it is the only wetland in Palestinian territories, and it's has a very rich biodiversity. So that's something which is very important to consider in terms of the landscape there. It's a very flat landscape, but lots of sand dunes well, when we were there were lots of sand dunes. I've seen more recent imagery, satellite imagery, and a lot of the sand dunes seem to have disappeared. But yeah, very sandy, and some of the sand dunes were quite high, sort of maybe 10 meters or so high when we were there. But the sand obviously just comes and goes, it just blows over. But there's amazing watery landscape around the mouth of the Wadi Gaza, and this sort of amazing wetland topography. And the other thing is just the fertility of it. It was certainly in the late 90s, it was a very, very sort of rich in terms of agricultural production. So all sorts of, sort of market things, tomatoes, vegetables, grapes, all sorts of things that are really, really fertile and really productive.
So as far as the Wadi Gaza goes, that would essentially be the hub for the majority of the archaeology in that area, I would imagine. What is the importance of it as far as the archaeology goes? So you mentioned there's agriculture around it. Are these agricultural fields turning up artifacts, and is that helping you as an archaeologist to focus in on certain areas?
They are turning up. The site that we were engaged with, we went to work in Moghraqa, that was actually revealed because sand dunes were cleared away to extend agriculture into the area for farming, and so Al Moghraqa sort of popped out of the ground, and sort of the adjacent field systems had Middle Bronze Age through to beginning of the Late Bronze Age pottery there. So that was found through removal of sand dunes, but yeah, the locals were finding stuff, not necessarily yet. And again, in the 90s, there wasn't that much of an infrastructure. There was a Palestinian Department of Antiquities, which came under the auspices of the Department of Antiquities in the West Bank. But it was difficult. It was hard for them, but they did find these sites, and they were doing their best to protect these sites. So other sites were known because you do get these low tell sites in the region. A tell is a site where you just get repeated layers of occupation in the same area, and it sort of gradually builds up over time. So the main sites that were known, Tel Sanam and Tel El Ajul, was because they just stood out in the landscape. They're quite obvious. I'm not sure how Drudi Datan found Dar El Balah, which is a little bit further south. Tel Rakesh, which is a bit further south again. That was just a lovely little hotel, very close to the coast. I think so. So some of it's just because there obviously are archaeological sites. Some of it is turning up through farming, but I don't know. It was certainly at the time that I was there, that wasn't necessarily being picked up necessarily by local archaeologists. It was difficult infrastructure time.
Yeah, it sounds that way. I've never had the opportunity to speak with someone that has worked in that environment. So having such a dynamic environment of the shifting of sands and dunes and all that, as an archaeologist, how do you begin to focus in on regions and areas, and how do you deal with that dynamic movement as far as marking sites and returning to those sites? How does that?
Yeah, I think the key thing is local knowledge. That's the really, really important thing, local knowledge, and building up a good relationship with the people who work those fields. And that was really what stood us in really good stead in Al Moghraqa. There was a Bedouin family who farmed the fields that we were interested in, and we built up quite a close relationship with them. They helped us a lot and looked after the site for us, and they told us things. They also told us about stuff which they'd found there, and showed us stuff. So that's one thing. And Maureen Sadek, who was the director of the Department of Antiquities, he was really very proactive in going around and sort of going and visiting areas where bulldozing was going on, and talking to people. So yeah, he was doing a good job as well, sort of given the constraints at the time. But he was the person who identified Al Moghraqa, found it, and told us about it.
Yeah, well, again, you can always depend on the locals. Of course, they live there. They know the land better than anyone. And, that's very much the same here in the United States as well. So I find that very interesting and admirable that they're willing to help you and assist in the archaeology. And we will return to that a little bit later in our conversation. But right now, let's really establish Gaza as an archaeological area, because it actually has a very, very ancient heritage, going back even pre-dynastic in Egypt to some degree. So I really want to dive into the timeline and look at some of the key influences over the area, because it's located in such a way that it's a wonderful area for ancient communication. It has a trade nexus. It's just kind of in the perfect location in the southern Levant, close to Egypt. All of those things are there together. So where shall we begin with the history of Gaza? There's items there that seem to be even pre-dynastic in Egypt. So wherever you think is the best place to begin the story of Gaza.
Now, this is such a good question, because sadly, our knowledge of the true extent of the archaeology is very, very limited. It's really stuff that people have gone and worked with. So yes, you're right. Some of the earliest stuff that we know about is what we would call early Bronze Age in a Levantine context in the archaeology of Syro-Palestine, going right way back to early Bronze 1, which is contemporary with probably what you'd call Dynasty 0 in Egypt. So just before the unification of Egypt. There is undoubtedly earlier stuff there. And this is one of the really sad things, is that we don't know about the prehistoric landscape there. The early communities who undoubtedly would have been moving through that landscape and sort of making use of the rich resources around the Wadi Gaza. There are reports, I think, in one of Petrie's excavation reports of field walking by a guy called Starkey and finding Paleolithic tools. But I don't know about the Paleolithic and the Epipaleolithic in that region. But humans would have gone through this route on their way as they left Africa, coming in, and there's a really rich sort of evidence of human activity in the middle Paleolithic and Upper Paleolithic in modern day Israel, and the Epipaleolithic's really well understood. So we don't know about that. So I'm assuming it's there. We did in our own field work in Moghraqa, we were shown by the local Bedouin farmers a chalcolithic basalt tripod mortar that they had found. And this was taken by the Palestinian Department of Antiquities. I have no idea what's happened to it now. It is published. We published it. We had a good drawing of it and some nice photos of it. So it is published. But and so that shows some chalcolithic activity there, and basalt comes up from the north, the area of the Golan Heights and things. So it shows the sort of the movement of people. We know that there's chalcolithic people in the Negev. So, possibly there's something going on in Gaza there which hasn't been identified. There's Tariq there, which is Chalcolithic Early Bronze 1. And the really important Early Bronze site was found about the time that we were working in Gaza. It was found through bulldozing. In fact, much of the tell was destroyed in bulldozing. It's a site called Tel Sakhan. And that was excavated by Murashedi of the Ecole Biblique, and he did a fantastic job, sort of working out what was going on there. And that was amazing. So that's the earliest activity there is early Bronze 1, and I think there's early Bronze 3 and 4 also at Tel Sakhan. So
it establishes that heritage, and again, I don't think people maybe realize just how much archaeology and history is there. However, being that it was such an area of communication and trade, we see so many different cultures maybe moving through the area. So, the Canaanites and various other groups that people may be familiar with. Obviously, it's changed hands. The land and everything has changed hands over the millennia. But I know there's some other sites that I've heard you speak about before that really speak to Gaza as being a communication and trade nexus. Balakia, is that one of the more prominent sites that kind of show that?
There's several sites. Balakia is an Iron Age site down to, I think, the Persian periods, which has been excavated by the École Biblique Jean-Baptiste Humbert in the École Biblique. And that was on the coast. It was from what I recall, there was a harbour there, and it was a trading site looking outwards. The connectivity is just evident in, I think, every single site that's been excavated. So Tel Sakan, which I mentioned, there was an Egyptian residency established there, an early bronze one, and this is really exciting. I don't think there's been enough made of it in wider discussions. There's an early phase of Egyptian colonization in the southern Levant, Syria, sort of Israel-Palestine, in this Dynasty Zero. So before the unification of Egypt, you get some Egyptian colonies and residencies established in various places, and Tel Sakan is the one that is closest to Egypt, so it's probably their first port of call. And the lovely thing there is the excavators found some pottery, with some Egyptian pottery with what are called sereks, and a serek is a king's name. So although we haven't got the Egyptian unified state, there were Egyptian rulers, and they had their name in a serek, which is a little picture of a palace facade, and the name would be written, there'd be a depiction of the god Horus on top, and then the king's name would be written inside the palace facade. And the really exciting thing is that Narmer has been identified at Tel Sakan. So Narmer, who might be the king who unified Egypt, definitely sent a pot to Tel Sakan, so it's a contemporary. So I think that's really, really exciting. And then Dar el-Balah, in the late Bronze Age, again, you get evidence for Egyptian military activity and residential activity there. Tel el-Ashul, lots of evidence for Cypriot trade and exchange in particular, but also lovely Egyptian stuff, including, I think, in the so-called governor's tomb, a lovely ring with the name of Tutankhamun on it. So, you've always got these sort of international connections. That was the lifeblood of Gaza. It was for trade and exchange and contact and commerce and movement of military forces.
No, that's fascinating. And okay, so I want to back up for just a moment, because you said the name of Narmer, and we're talking about Narmer from the Narmer palette, that iconic Egyptian artifact. So we're seeing possible connection really back to the very beginning of unification of Egypt. I think that speaks volumes about how much they were moving and interacting with people in that region. I just find that amazing. I find that amazing because this is the only other piece of archaeology or artifact that I've ever heard of outside of the Narmer palette. Could build on that just a little bit?
Sure, yeah. But I think the important thing about Gaza is its location. It's right at the end. The Wadi Gaza marks the end of the land route between Egypt and the southern Levant, which is known as the Ways of Horus. Sort of once the Egyptians start moving out of Egypt and into the southern Levant, it's always along this land route. And Narmer, I think there are a few other named these little sereks turning up in a few other sites in the southern Levant. The one I know about is the one from Tel Sakan, but there are a few others, and there's a fair amount of evidence. Maybe even if you go a little bit earlier, going into the Chalcolithic in the southern Levant, there's the things like the Nahal Mishmar hoards in the Negev and various other things where you see Egyptian influence coming in time and time again. You get to see Egyptian hippopotamus ivory being exported. The concept of the mace head, which the Egyptian pharaoh very famously, and Narmer's the first one we see doing it, grabs the top knot, the hair of his enemies, and is smiting him, whacking him over the head of a mace. And the Egyptians sort of aggrandize these, so you get these amazing sort of large ceremonial mace heads mace heads become very important also in the southern Levant in the Chalcolithic period. So there's lots of this connectivity, but I think the thing which is so important for Gaza is that Gaza is sort of acting as a gateway between Egypt and Syria-Palestine. The Egyptians have to go through there. As soon as they reach there, they build there. So we see Tel Sakan in the early Bronze Age, this amazing Egyptian residency there, and evidence of Egyptian pottery production, Egyptian royal named objects, which is so important. An Egyptian royal named object shows a direct link back to the ruler, and shows that this was an official activity. In the late Bronze Age, where we see the Egyptians again coming out, they're able to, in the 18th dynasty, they get rid of the Hyksos, the Asiatic rulers of northern Egypt, and then they want to make sure they want a buffer, and Gaza becomes the buffer between Egypt and Palestine. And so we see Tel el-Ajul, one of the so-called palaces excavated by Petrie, was definitely an Egyptian residency. And then in the 19th dynasty, we see a residency or an Egyptian administrative building being constructed at Dar el-Balah, and we see lots of other exciting things at Dar el-Balah, which I won't go into just yet. So yeah, I think this is key for Gaza, but it's not just this Egypt-Levant thing. You get stuff coming in from the Arabian Peninsula, coming across into the southern Levant and then being traded out into the Mediterranean, and you get all sorts of other connections there. So it really is, sort of a melting pot, of human relations, of human interaction throughout the Bronze Age and probably beyond.
From an archaeological perspective, when you have that many influences on an area, how do you begin from the archaeology? When you're going through the stratigraphy and you're moving down, are you continuously finding various influences from different cultures, and how do you begin to catalog and record all of those things?
We're incredibly lucky in that the archaeology of the surrounding region has been so well done over the last century or more. There's been so much work in Egypt, in Syria, Palestine, Israel, and in Cyprus and in the Aegean, that the material culture of all these places is very well understood. What isn't necessarily addressed by people is what happens when stuff moves around. So, people talk about trade and exchange, and they'll spend a lot of time discussing this, but they don't necessarily think what happens to the community who receives these things, and how does stuff get assimilated. And that's the area that I think I increasingly became interested in Gaza. And it's where I returned to what we looked at Moghraqa. It's just this sort of way in which things get reinvented, thought through, get used in slightly different ways. So there might be Aegean pottery being used in the Gaza region, but they might be using it in a way that is more in keeping with a Canaanite population than an Aegean population. Egyptian stuff comes in, and elites in particular, they like to appropriate it. So there are lots of Egyptian named objects and throughout the Levant, and Tutankhamun, Tutmosis III is the most famous one, but we do get Tutankhamun in Gaza. We get various other names turning up. But I can't necessarily assume that people in that region could read the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but they probably knew of the significance, and that it meant something. That the royal power and these authority of the king was being transmitted with that, even if you can read it. So yes, I think it's really just because other people have done the background work, so you can sort of work out what is local and what isn't. And then the interesting thing is when the local influences, when the exotic influences the local, so you get local production of Egyptian pottery, for example, which happens quite a bit, and other things.
Now, that's very interesting how local inhabitants may be putting their own regional flair on something that was essentially coming from Egypt. But again, with the archaeology, you can recognize something maybe of Egyptian origin, but then throughout that area of Gaza, I would imagine that you would see a kind of local adaptation. Is that correct?
Yes, there's definitely, and that's something that we focused on very particularly in Moghraqa. The reason why the site actually sort of sang to us, sprang out, and we wanted to work there wasn't just that it was late Bronze Age, but because when it was discovered, a large quantity of broken ceramic cones were found, which are very similar to an Egyptian funerary cone, which I can explain those in a bit. But these ones were marked differently. These were marked with the name of the great Egyptian military ruler, Thutmose III. He was the guy who really did establish the Egyptian New Kingdom Empire throughout the Levant. So, and we know from ancient Egypt, from the annals of Thutmose III, that he attacked Gaza in year 22 of his reign. So I thought, oh my goodness, we've got this record here of year 22 of the reign of Thutmose III. But when we went and actually started working, we found lots and lots of fragments of these cones. No complete ones in the excavation, but lots of fragments. But enough of them have been found just on the surface of the site. And a couple of them had the name of Hatshepsut, who Thutmose III took great care to obliterate her name. So this clearly sort of said that whatever was going on with these cones was much earlier than year 22 of his reign. It's in the co-regency of Thutmose III and Hatshepsut. And where we became interested in them was what they actually represented, because they looked like an Egyptian funerary cone, and funerary cones are about 35 centimeters long, and they would have a bibliography written on the front round face of an Egyptian noble, and they'd be set up around the entranceway into the tombs of the nobles in Thebes. So they're very much a Theban phenomenon in Egypt. And they'd always just have on the round front face, just this bibliography of the person who was buried in the tomb. We didn't have that. We had an inscription on the round face of the ruler, and it was sort of an abbreviated one. So it was the cartouche of Thutmose III, but it didn't have the title associated with the cartouche. And then on the top side, sort of perpendicular with the round face, there was another cartouche sort of stamped in. It's actually quite hard to do that as well. I've had my students making lots of these cones, and we made a stamp for them and trying to do it. It's actually quite a tricky thing to do. And these were all consistently broken off at around 10 centimeters. And we only found one pointy tip of the cone, but we had lots and lots of the round faces. So we think that they were being used to mark the entrance to a building, and that at some point that the building had been demolished, and that might have been deliberately, but these cones had been sort of cut off from the facade and just dumped somewhere. And it didn't seem like it was an Egyptian practice. It didn't relate exactly to what the Egyptians were doing in Thebes. And so it seemed to be a local adaptation of something very Egyptian. It's obviously Egyptian royal authority, but it seemed to be simplified for a local Canaanite audience, so that they'd see the name of the king. They might not be able to read the name of the king, but they'd see the name of the king, and it would just say, this is Egyptian royalty, this is Egyptian royal authority. But exactly, we have no evidence that they had a funerary use. They might have had an administrative use. We don't know, but that seems to be a sort of a really interesting local adaptation under Egyptian influence of an Egyptian funerary object in a very different context. And it's quite hard to really work out what was going on.
No, to be able to find something like that, especially with the presence of Hatshepsut, who's the co-regent under Thutmose III, is phenomenal. This is news to me. I haven't heard of those type of artifacts being found. As you mentioned earlier, oftentimes these type of things would be destroyed in Egypt proper. So very, very interesting. I would love to actually see some photographs of that. But nonetheless, Gaza as a nexus, a cultural heritage that is so deep and rich. I know that when you're doing archaeology, and we kind of discussed this early on, about getting to know the locals, getting to know the people of the region. So my next question concerning Gaza is, what is the attitude of the locals concerning the archaeology and the discoveries that are found there? Do they take ownership of it? Have you had any issues that we see in other places, such as looting and selling things off on the black market? Tell us a little bit about the local community and how they interact with the site.
That's a really good question. And I am going to have to caveat this with my experience in Gaza finished in 2000. So there's a good quarter century since I was last there. Certainly when I was working in Gaza, there was a lot of interest. It was a luxury, sort of archaeology was something that the Gazans couldn't necessarily really do themselves because they had other more pressing concerns, sort of work, food, water, electricity supplies. Those are their priorities. But we work very closely with the British Council, and we had students from the university in Gaza coming and working with us. We were very fortunate. We met a businessman in Gaza, and he looked at his private collection. So obviously there was nowhere for things to go. But we advised him on what he had and, upkeep of it. And he paid for some work boys for us and some of our equipment. And I think he eventually established a museum in Gaza. And I understand that until recently, there were 4 museums in Gaza with antiquities. And when I was there, that was an aspiration. There were no museums. So I don't know much about that. But we certainly with students who are learning English in the British Council, they came and visited the excavations. They came and looked at the stuff that we found. They were absolutely fascinated. And we also did an illustrated exhibition of Gaza in the British Council. And again, there was a lot of interest in that locally. People were fascinated. We managed to get photos, from and images, as many early images as we could, and wrote a history of Gaza, and that toured around Gaza. And my colleague Joanne Clark, who was running the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem at the time, which is now the Kenyan Institute, she also worked with the British Council, taking around to sort of little archaeology excavation things for school kids. So there was a lot of interest. People wanted to know about their past. They wanted to know about the archaeology, but it wasn't necessarily their first concern. It was something that they were glad that other people were doing. But I know more recently, a couple of years, I think last year or maybe the year before, a Palestinian farmer found a beautiful mosaic in Gaza and very carefully excavated it. I don't know what's happened to that subsequently, but I think people are interested. People are always interested in their archaeology, and I think probably the one thing I'm quite sad at is that we haven't provided a publication in Arabic for them, but we did, sort of try and give back in other ways in terms of community action in Gaza.
Well, that's excellent. And, it's always helpful when people take interest in ownership in their own archaeology. But speaking about that and about the community, let's take a moment to kind of highlight the Hidden Paths project. So what was that based around, and what is the general goal and idea behind Hidden Paths?
Okay, yeah. So Hidden Paths was an AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, had a big flagship sort of call for research, so it's called Care for the Future, and they funded Hidden Paths, and that was on the back of excavations that I've done in Eredu in Cyprus. And what I found in Eredu was that there was right from the beginning of working at the site, there was a lot of cooperation, a lot of curiosity, became totally embedded in the village, real friendships forged with the local villagers. And what we found over the years of excavating was that the questions and the attitudes to the archaeology shifted. And at the beginning, they were a bit perplexed that we were spending so much time retrieving lots of broken pottery. They couldn't understand why we were focusing in on the sherds and why we were recovering these, and they weren't sort of beautiful whole pots that would end up in a museum. But we'd explain what we were doing and why we were doing it, and then they saw, got a lovely collection of pots from a workroom that we excavated, all completely smashed. And when they saw the end results, they were amazed by sort of what little sherds could tell you about could become. So it's really sort of in response to their interest and their curiosity about the past. It was trying to work more closely with the community, and in particular with the village school, to try and sort of give them access to and knowledge about their archaeology and haptic engagement with it. So we did a lot of work with the village school. We prepared sort of some teaching materials. We did lots of hands-on workshops. We found several large grinding stones, and we'd take them, and the kids would have a go at grinding grain on their ancestors' grinding stones, and we'd tell them the history of the site. But the other thing that we were interested in was that there was quite a lot of really interesting, more recent history, and it's sort of trying to weave the two together, and sort of these sort of various different narratives, some of which are quite hidden, about the past of the village, and sort of saying, well, this is a really long past. It goes back 3,000 years. You've got your ancestors were working fields there very similar to what's going on today, but also that some of the more modern histories were quite interesting and quite complex, problematic histories. So things about Aoka in the village, the so-called freedom fighters of, I think, the British at the end of the British Protectorate, stories that should be recorded and recovered going back to the Ottoman occupation of Cyprus. And so there are all these lovely stories, and we're trying to find a way of binding them together to sort of show how histories and people haven't really changed, and sort of try and give a sense of ownership back to the villagers. And one of our aims was to try and establish a museum for the village. And again, there was this sort of dichotomy between our experience working in the village, working with the villagers, and then going into Nicosia and working with the Department of Antiquities. And there was a sort of a huge chasm between the two, and it was very difficult to try and bridge that. We would explain, we'd talk to the Department of Antiquities and ask about the right way to set up a museum in the village, which is possible, and we'd explain it to the villagers. And then, but we were sort of almost gatekeepers of knowledge between these two communities. So we were trying to find ways of allowing to facilitate that interaction, that connection with the archaeological authorities in the Department of Antiquities. That bit sort of didn't work, but the school kids engagement, we went back to sort of several times, and they remembered, and they were telling me how old the site was and what it was important for, and all sorts of things. By the end, they knew it, and the teachers were incorporating it into their own teaching and taking the kids up to the site. So it sort of gave them a sense of pride that they had this really ancient site on their doorstep.
And as it should, again, those things are so important, and they can really help build up the pride and the culture of a local region. I know one thing that you are very passionate about is the study of contested landscapes. This area has long been influenced by various cultures, people coming and going. It's been, ruled by different people, different cultures at different times. Collectively, when you're dealing with a contested landscape, how does that shape culture? How does that create an identity among the people that live in a region like Gaza?
That's a really good question. And I think there's sort of many different ways in which that actually sort of shapes out. I think sort of intriguingly, the two places in the world that I've chosen to really invest my time as an archaeologist have both been contested landscapes. So Gaza, even today, a contested landscape throughout its history. And this was the thing we found with our illustrated history of Gaza. It was just a litany of invasion, occupation, population movements. And I think that fosters a sense of place. And we see the same in Cyprus. Cyprus obviously the island today is split in two. There's a Greek population and a Turkish population on the island. Actually, there's not much difference between the Greeks and the Turkish population, and they used to intermarry quite a lot. And there are other smaller groups, the Maronites and other smaller groups on the island. But Eredu is very, very close to the Green Line, and we were very close to this sort of no-go zone. And I think what it does in terms of identity, it really grounds you in a sense of belonging and a sense of you are of the earth. It is really important to you, and it's no sort of secret that sort of when you get displaced populations, there will be things that they will hold on to, sort of over many, many years, that they'll hold on to stuff which comes from where they were displaced from. So I've seen this in Eredu, some of the older members of the community, because we were very close to the Green Line. They actually came from northern Cyprus, and I remember talking to a woman in the cafe on the local coffee shop, and she got out a box and she had the key to her old house in northern Cyprus and photographs of it, and she was showing us these photos and the key. And I've seen similar things in Palestine, sort of the key from the house. Most of the population in Gaza is a displaced population from the rest of Palestine, that from 48, not most, but many of them. And again, that's that thing of the key, which is that link back to where you come from. And the other thing which saw a lot in Cyprus is the importance of earth. And people go back to when the border opened in Cyprus for Cypriots 20 years ago. People will go back and visit their old house, and quite often they just take back some earth from the ground where the house was, and they knew they could go back and live there. But so I think that really is the importance. It really, really shapes that sense of sort of where you come from, and the importance of that earth, and the importance of something from home which you hold with you. That's with the modern population. With the ancient population, it's hard to tell. We used to see, maybe in some cases sort of resistance to maybe things from Egypt or foreign places, and other times you might see hybridity. I suppose it just depends on what the nature of that conflict is, or that contact is, and how it plays out. But in the modern world, it really is very emotive, and it is really very tactile, haptic engagement with things.
Yes, it's very inspirational, and I understand, that longing to return home, wanting to take a piece of that with you. And certainly I think it probably would be very similar over the millennia as we look back in time. I have learned so much, Dr. Steel, tonight. Also, in prepping for this interview, this has opened up a whole new line of education and inquiry for me. So I'm very excited about learning more about this region. There was so much more to it than I had previously known. So I think this was very important. But before we wrap up tonight, now that we've learned about both Cyprus and all of the wonderful archaeology of Gaza, I know something else that you are currently working on, that you are very passionate about, is the idea of new materialities, exploring the relationship that people have with matter and how this is really worked into their lives. Now, it kind of hits on what we were just talking about, the earth and taking it back home with you. And I think really when we look at archaeology, there's so many unknowns. There's so many things that we can never know. But one thing that we can focus on, and it's kind of the heart of archaeology, is that material culture. So tell us about new materialities, what that means exactly, and what is your research looking like to this point?
Probably do a whole session just on new materialities, actually. But this is something which is really exciting, and it's probably not actually that new now. It's sort of been bubbling along for the last 10, 15 years in not just archaeology, but all the social sciences have just sort of wholeheartedly embraced this new movement. And it's this, I think part of it is just questioning the position of humans in the world, this idea that we have in the West or in Euro-American sort of ontologies or ways of thinking about the world. You know, we are, we've got this whole world at our beck and call, and we can do what we like with it. And it sort of questions that and sort of forces us to reconsider that we are just part of the earth. We are part of the world. We are part of the matter of the earth. And when we die, we return to the earth. And so it really, at one level, it's forcing people to confront human exceptionalism, and it sort of questions all sorts of things. It's great fun to play around with students. It's sort of questioning what is a thing, you know, sort of how distinct we are from the matter of the world. That's, you know, the thing which the book which really did it for me, there's a wonderful book by a guy called Carlo Rovelli, and it's called Helgoland. And it sort of takes you into the world of quantum physics, and it just makes you realize, you know, how the world is just things in relationship, or matter in relationship. And so for me, the new materialisms is just thinking about the matter of the world, and how if rather than thinking about humans controlling the world and the world being inert matter waiting for us to do things, it's sort of thinking about when you make pottery that you're in correspondence with the clay, you're working with it, and the clay forces you to work in particular ways, and the end result isn't just the imagination and the skills and capacities of the potter. It is also about the agency of the clay that you're working with this, and different clays allow different outcomes, and different materials allow different outcomes. And when you start talking to artisans, I was just talking to some boat makers in Southampton a few months ago. I went to the Southampton Boat Fair, and they were talking very much about how the wood allows that, you know, you can only make a boat in a certain way because of what the wood will allow you to do. And if you talk to metallurgists, again, it's that sort of metals behave in particular ways. So it sort of makes you realize how everything is in relationship, and then I think it just opens up new possibilities to thinking about what's going on in the world. There's quite a bit that I published with a colleague of mine, Lucia Dalla, and we've got a new book coming out, just do a little plug here now, called Earthy Matter. And there's sort of got scholars from all over the world just thinking about the different ways in which people engage with the physical matter of the earth. So I look at ochre. I've got friends and colleagues who are looking at plaster, looking at soil, and just from this perspective where you don't think about humans doing things to the matter, but you think about humans and the substances working together. And I think it's got a lot of exciting potentials. It makes you rethink, you know, sort of what we're doing. And I think it's quite important just where we are in the world at the moment with the, you know, the climate crisis and the sort of the sun dawning realization that the planet is not an infinite resource, but, you know, so it makes you rethink things a little bit.
No, I think you did a wonderful job there, and that is something that I am very interested in. You know, I often say that I'm a big proponent of ritual, in that it's something that's lost. Ritual gives you something to focus on. It gives you a quiet time to be a part of something, and I think this would play into that very well. So I would definitely be looking for that publication when it's available. That is certainly something I would like to discuss, and if you would be willing to come back on the show when that book is available, I would really love to get more into the details of that. So as we begin to wrap up tonight, my final point that I would like to discuss with you, without any political affiliation or slant, you discussed earlier 4 museums, all these wonderful archaeological sites. The world right now is aware of the situation in Gaza. Have you received any information or updates on any of the archaeological sites, any of the museums, and what condition that they may be in currently?
Actually, interestingly enough, I was talking with a couple of guys from Bellingcat, which is their investigative journalists who are actually investigating what is happening to the archaeology on the ground. So we did have a discussion about this, and comparing photographs before and after what happened, you know, sort of last September, October. my understanding, and bearing in mind this is secondhand knowledge, is that the museums have been destroyed. That is what I was informed of yesterday. I have no knowledge of really of what's going down on the ground, but sort of logic dictates that they probably have been. They were all based in Gaza City, or in and around Gaza City. So I'm not particularly hopeful as the preservation of the antiquities. I don't know. I've seen some satellite images of the area where I was working, Moghraqa, down to the site of Sanam, which is just south of the Wadi Gaza, and that looks sort of okay. I don't know. I honestly don't know what state it's in. It is concerning, but there are other concerns as well.
No, you're right. There are certainly many things to be concerned about in that region. And we just hope that in the future we'll be able to revisit some of those areas and learn more about the wonderful history and archaeology of Gaza. We've been speaking tonight with Dr. Louise Steel from the University of Wales. Again, Dr. Steel, thank you so much for your time. This has been truly illuminating for me. I've learned so much, and this really has opened up many doors of areas that I want to continue to research and learn more about this area. And I hope all of our listeners will do the same. As we conclude tonight, if anyone's interested in your work, if anyone's interested in your publications or presentations, what's the best way for someone to find out what's new with you and follow along with you online?
Hi, thank you, Jason. I have an academia edu page, so that's where I post most of my articles as they're coming up. So that's probably where I go. I'm also working with UNESCO-MOST BRIDGES, and we're updating our website. So Bridges Earth, something to look at there, and that's where my new sort of research is taking me for the future. So those are the two places I go to: academia and Bridges Earth.
Another fascinating conversation. I really want to thank Dr. Louise Steel for taking the time. Again, someone who has so much experience in that area, working in Crete, also working in Gaza. And, the history of Gaza was something, as far as the ancients go, I had really not much, information on, not a whole lot of knowledge. And so I feel much more comfortable with that area of the Levant, and everything that was happening there was certainly a huge part of ancient history for all of the cultures involved. So again, a very special thanks to Dr. Louise Steel. And, we're again trying to mix it up, get different topics here, but I think this was a great way to really spread our wings here on the podcast and bring a new product to our listeners.
Well, certainly. And of course, again, it goes without saying that right now, that particular part of the world is absolutely ravaged. Our hearts go out to all of those who are affected by these sorts of situations, but also a very relevant perspective on all this from the archaeological perspective has to do with the preservation of the past. And unfortunately, during times of conflict, as we know, often archaeology also can be destroyed, and we lose aspects of the past that otherwise inform us today about what the ancient way of life was like. So it's so important to be able to preserve all that knowledge. And again, Jason, so good that you were able to have Dr. Steel on the program to talk with us about this, because as you mentioned, all areas from the Stone Age to the Wood Age, and of course to the technological age of today, all these ages are of great importance to us. I think that about wraps it up here, gentlemen, for this installment. And so it's time, as always, before we leave, to pony up one last time at the Cross Time Pub. You gents game?
Always.
Let's cast another die, play another game, or maybe in this case, we'll toss our Roman dodecahedrons like real dungeon masters. Anyway, follow our work online at 7ages.org, and don't forget about that Patreon page with additional content, the Green Dragon Book Club, Digging Deeper, and so much more. On behalf of James Waldo, Jason Pentrail, and of course yours truly, Micah Hanks, it is the 7 Ages Audio Journal, and we'll see you next time somewhere in time.